I'm the local history coordinator here at the Licking County Library. And today I want to talk to you about what I call the modern history of the Great Circle Mound. You know, at one time Licking County was dotted with so many mounds and stone forts, but sadly most of them we destroyed one way or the other in the name of progress. But today I want to look at the Great Circle Mound and how, for good or for bad, however you look at it, it was preserved by the early settlers. I've got an awful lot of information. Hopefully I'll get us out of here by probably 9 or 10 o'clock. No, I do have a lot of information, a lot I couldn't include. So if I don't include some favorite thing that you know, please let me know, because I may not know it. I'm not going to say I'm the expert on the Great Circle history from when the white settlers discovered it. So if you've got something, please let me know. This is a copy of the Squire Davis map that detailed the mounds in Newark. This was created in 1837 to 1847. The Great Circle Mound down there marked with a locator. The early settlers really didn't know what to make of it. When they found it, they surmised that because it was a circle, it had only one entrance, it had a moat on the inside, that it was a fort, that it was an Indian fort. So they mostly referred to it for years as the Old Fort. Isaac Stadden was one of the first settlers in the area from Pennsylvania. He found the mounds in October of 1800. In the book 1909 Centennial History of Licking County, his wife said it this way. Mrs. Stadden related that late in October 1800, her husband went into Cherry Valley to hunt deer, that being a better hunting ground than the Licking Valley. He came home in the evening greatly excited, having discovered the old fort, of which he had not heard. The next morning, we mounted our horses and we took a good look at this great curiosity, riding all round it on top of the embankment. So far as known, they were the first white persons who saw this great work of antiquity. There was another early remembrance of the mounds found in a 1913 book, Memories of Martha Seymour Coleman. Martha was there on the right. This is her father, Nathan, here on the left. She was born in Quakertown, New Jersey. They moved to Newark in 1832. She wrote, "The old fort, which was 2 miles west of Newark, greatly interested my father. We were often there. He then said that when the Schenck heirs, whose property it was, should come of age so that this land could be sold, he would buy it, and he did. The old fort which my father owned is a prehistoric or mound builder's temple, a circular embankment a mile in circumference and now perhaps 20 feet high, more rather than less. Great trees have grown on it, fallen and decayed, so this embankment must be much worn down. And the ditch which is on the inside, showing it to have been for religious rather than military purpose, has been still more filled up. The entrance to the circle is symmetrical, the embankment being brought out on each side as 2 great gates, swung back and precisely alike. In the center, the figure of a bird or eagle with outspread wings can be clearly traced. Though it is of course washed and worn down, it is one of the greatest mound groups in Ohio." Now, according to her, the City Council of Newark tried to buy the mounds from her father to use as a new city cemetery when they were closing this city cemetery down. He told them no, so they eventually bought Cedar Hill Cemetery out to the east end of town. She wrote, "Still, the disposition to keep the fort as private property caused some criticism and not public-spirited, so when the Licking County Agricultural Society asked for it, my father deeded it to them on the condition that no trees should be cut on the embankment or within 20 feet of it, and also that we should have a private gate opening into it from adjoining land that he owned. We used that gate a few years, but soon relinquished that right. We, the heirs, have been asked for permission to cut a passage through the embankment, that cattle from the stalls outside might be led to the show ring a shorter way than to go round to the entrance. But we never consented to that, and the officers did not quite dare to do it, though probably we could not legally prevent it. Fortunately, they didn't allow that embankment to be cut through." So in 1853, the Great Circle was purchased by the Licking County Agricultural Society from Nathan and Martha Seymour. Also, Henry and Catherine Holler had some land, and a Mr. Woodruff of New Jersey had some land that went into the deal. I found where a citizens meeting was called to raise $8,000 to purchase it, but an 1857 Lincoln County Fair report that was reprinted in the 1932 Advocate stated the grounds cost $10,000 and consisted of 46 acres when they bought it. So it was originally purchased for the Lincoln County Fair site, but in 1854, it was chosen as the site of the 5th Ohio State Fair. This lithograph is upstairs in the Lincoln County Library if you want to ever look at it. Doesn't blow up very good. The fair was scheduled to open on Tuesday, September 19th, but it was postponed because of the cholera epidemic. It opened almost a month later on October 17th. It continued to be used as county fairs up till the Civil War and after, but in her book Ellen Hayes wrote called Wild Turkeys and Tallow Candles, she wrote about going to the fairgrounds before the Civil War. She said, "The Agricultural Society had secured the old fort for fairground purposes. It was like holding a bazaar at Stonehenge. Of the hundreds of people who gathered on these grounds each year, probably only a few, if any, were interested in the fact that the great circular embankment with its inside moat and stately entrance was the work of a vanished race. I was old enough to feel its dignity, though not old enough to analyze the feeling. And as I had never been to any other fair, I was disposed to conclude that all fairs were held on such grounds." When the Civil War began, in October, Colonel Charles Woods decided to raise a regiment of Lincoln County volunteers. He there took out that announcement in the 1861 Advocate, and he said that we would be meeting at the fairgrounds near Newark. Once they got their companies together, they went into encampment inside the fairgrounds. Charles Dana Miller was serving with, he was a captain, he served with Captain Levi Coleman. He was with Company C. He wrote about their experience at the Mound Builders. He said, "The first night I spent in camp, which would have been about November 1st, I was cold and freezing. I laid myself down on the ground with a single blanket, a large tent with many others. My place happened to be next to the door, and I spent the night without sleep and shivering as if my body would fall to pieces. This was a sudden change indeed from the elegantly furnished room I had in town. The cold ground was not as comfortable as my curled hair-spring mattress. It was a mistaken idea we had that we must invite hardship in the start when we could as well have made ourselves comfortable. I managed to find business out of camp afterwards so that I could sleep in houses until the recruiting services had ended, and we commenced regular drill and routine of camp duties. But we made our quarters more cozy and spent the winter comparatively comfortable. Here the men spent their time drilling and learning how to be soldiers. In the evening, sentries were on the mounds to keep the men from leaving for whatever reason. Miller recounts that even with that, many would slip out and spend most of the night in town. There was one soldier from his company that was suspected of doing this. One evening, Captain Coleman noticed him missing and sent Miller with a squad of men to go to Newark and find him. Dividing the squad, one half marched down the canal and the other took the railroad. About halfway, we met the missing man, demanded his reasons for absence from camp without a pass. He claimed he was obliged to go down to procure soap, and ever after that, the boys would tease him about soap. We marched him back to camp under arrest, and he spent several days in the guardhouse. While they were camped out there, they encountered a measles outbreak that swept through the camp. On February 8th, they marched from Mound Builders downtown here to the B&O station, where they went to war. During the Civil War, 2 shows were brought to the area for entertainment, and they were set up at the mounds. The first one, in July 27, 1863, was Gardner and Hemming's Great American Circus. They started out in Painesville, Ohio on July 1st. They planned on 24 shows across Ohio, going as far south as Cincinnati. The circus featured gymnastics, contortionists, singers, horses, clowns, trained dogs, and trained mules. Now, you might see from the schedule there, where it says Newark, it says left in a hurry, its provost marshal had ordered all horses to be taken for the capture of Morgan. While they were on tour, Confederate General John Hunt Morgan had entered Ohio on July 13th, north of Cincinnati. Traveling east across the southern Ohio, he then ends up coming up through Zanesville to Salineville before he's captured in Lisbon. So their tour was He was captured right before they got here to New York, so their tour was a little bit hairy because they weren't quite sure where Morgan was. The second show, on May 2nd, 1865, was the second annual tour of the Monster Equus Curriculum, I'm going to guess. It featured 250 men and horses, circus performers from France, England, New York, acting bears from California. I don't know what they did, they acted. They trained fence-jumping buffalo, performing dogs, monkeys, and ponies. They set up inside the old fort those months and entertained the citizens of Newark. After the war, the old fort was used for many things, but a lot of it was held for veteran reunions. On July 4th, 1876, there was a centennial celebration by the Licking County Agricultural Society there. Then in October, the Licking County Fair was held there. In 1877, the 76 Ohio Volunteer Society had a reunion at the old fort. They then decided that they would try to plan a great reunion for all Civil War veterans in Ohio for the following year. They planned that out. They wrote to Ulysses S. Grant, who had to not come because he was on tour with his family in Milan, Italy. But President Hayes was here, the governor of Ohio was here, many officials. General William Tecumseh Sherman was here. They met down at the courthouse. They marched down Union Street to the old fort, where it was outside the enclosure. The ladies of the county had set up tables with food for all the veterans there. Inside the enclosure, next to the Eagle Mound, they had built a stage for all the speeches and such to be made. There were about 10,000 people in attendance, they estimate. Early on in the speeches, too many people leaned on one side of the stage and it collapsed. Then they moved to the other side of the stage and did the same thing. At that point, President Hayes and Sherman had to dive basically out of their chairs to keep from falling out of their chairs and being hurt. It is rumored to say that Sherman said, 100 drunk Licking County carpenters almost succeeded in doing what 1,000 rebel bullets didn't do. I cannot find that written down anywhere, except for as rumored. Like I say, they spread tables with food out there. Along the top of the mounds, they had books set on podiums where the veterans were to sign their names if they were for whichever regiment they served in Ohio. So they would go up there, they'd write down their names. They then had a miscellaneous book in case you weren't from Ohio regiment, and there were actually 2 Confederate veterans that signed their names in that. If you want to know more about the reunion, the library did make a video a couple years ago that is out on our YouTube channel called The Great Reunion. That photo on the right is the 76th reunion from 1890 that they took out there on the mounds. So, according to the New York Advocate, on September 24th, 1880, telephone wires were strung between New York and the fairgrounds. In 1884, October 13, Buffalo Bill brought his Wild West show to Newark. I've tried to find the correspondence between Buffalo Bill Cody and the Licking County Agricultural Society because I found reference to a letter from Cody to B.G. Smythe, who was the secretary. Apparently there was some dispute about how much he was going to have to pay for the mounds to have his show there. Because supposedly, Buffalo Bill to Cody said, quote, "We don't want to buy your fairgrounds. We just want an opportunity to enlighten and Christianize your people." I contacted the Buffalo Bill Museum to see if they had the correspondence. They didn't have the correspondence, but when I sent them this information, the guy that runs the museum, whatever his name is, he said that sounds like something Buffalo Bill would say. So how much of it's true, I don't know. But they must have agreed on a price because they got here on October 13th, 84. Buffalo Bill does return to Newark in later years. I think this was the only time, though, he was at the old fort. The other times I found he was on the circus grounds, which were down on 11th and Church. And then sometimes it just said, one year it said at the usual place. It's like, well, that helped me a lot. But I did find a remembrance by Warren King Moorhead. He was from Newark, and he wrote a book called The American Indian in the United States. And he wrote that when he was a boy, he attended the performance there, and he said, I shall ever remember my sensations when witnessing the great buffalo hunt. 3 or 4 old scarred bison were driven into the fairground enclosure by some whooping cowpunchers. Buffalo Bill himself dashed up alongside the lumbering animals and from a Winchester repeater discharged numerous blanks into the already powder-burned sides of the helpless creatures. The crowd, though, roared with appreciation as the cowpunchers pursued and rounded up the hapless bison before the grandstand. Buffalo Bill reined in his horse and spurring his horse so he would prance, bowed right and left. Picnics were a big thing that they always had, and if you go through old newspapers that are like the Facebook of today, everybody put their business. So if you had a family picnic, a business picnic out at the fort, it was announced. In 1887, there was a big picnic at the mounds, which did lead to a drive somehow to publicize the mounds. At that time, a Professor Abbey of Granville, though, disclaimed the existence of the mound builders. There was a movement that said basically the Indians did not have the wherewithal, the knowledge, or anything else to build this, so it had to be built by a lost race of white people or something, that one of the 10 tribes of Israel or something, just totally to disclaim the American Indians. So that's when that movement was kind of started, or was going around, was the late 1800s. In October of 1888, representatives from the Smithsonian visited the mounds, and in 1889 there were plans discussed to prepare a public park at the fairgrounds. In 1898, on June 1st, there was a grand opening of Idlewild Park. I think I went too far. No. Got my notes out. Okay. In 1890, there was a gymnastic event hosted by the Newark Turners. In July 4th, 1891, 4,000 passengers, according to this article in the Johnstown Independent, visited the old fort. In 1897, James Lingefelder leased the Great Circle, and at that point he decided he wanted to promote an amusement and recreation park. Now, Lingefelder was secretary to Homestead Building Association Bank. So, Idlewild Park, June 1st, 1898, Lingefelder opens Idlewild Park. One of the things, he had lots of things planned. One of the things was a hypnotist named Edwin Boone. He had him brought in, and I have to read you the whole story because I can't condense it enough to where it's as good as the story. So John Douglas, the young man whom Edwin Boone hypnotized and then buried under the 6 feet of earth at Idlewild Park Sunday night at 10, was taken from the grave at 5 o'clock Monday evening. 2 hours and a half later, the hypnotist, in the presence of a large crowd, resuscitated the young fellow, who walked from the saucer bicycle track as calmly as if nothing had happened. When the interment was made, the hypnotist announced that Douglas would remain in the ground without food or air until Tuesday evening. But he later decided to perform the resurrection while the Labor Day crowd was present. At the time Douglas was put to sleep, the professor declared the subject was in a state of suspended animation, that there was neither action of the lungs nor heart. Committee called from the audience reported that no pulse or respiration could be detected, and soon after the march to the grave just north of the Park Hotel was begun. The grave had been prepared in the presence of a number of spectators, and all declared that there was no air passages visible. A pine box was lowered, and in this Douglas was placed. A pane of thick glass was put over his face, and over the glass a tube leading to the surface of the ground. An incandescent lamp could be lowered through this wooden tube, giving a view of the sleeper's face. He lay as one dead, and not a few of the visitors at the Park Labor Day declared that it was a wax figure and not a man who was buried there. To satisfy the doubters, The hypnotist made a few passes over the grave and caused the wax figure to turn its head to one side. When the body was taken from the grave, it was carried to the theater, where it lay in state until the pallbearers carried the tightly closed coffin to the center of the bicycle track arena. The coffin lid was raised and remains exposed to view. At a signal, Douglas was lifted from the casket. Every muscle was rigid, but after the professor had made a pass or two, every muscle relaxed. He opened his eyes, looked around in a bewildered way, and after a moment or two, walked to the hotel where he was refreshed, having been without food or drink for 19 hours. There's no doubt that Douglas was without food and drink for 19 hours, but everyone will not believe that he had no air. The hypnotist told an advocate rep that he's now on his way to conduct a series of experiments with the New York Journal, chief of which is to plant his man Douglas for 7 days. This man went around for like 3 years doing this, burying these guys. So in July of 1901, 9,500 tickets are sold at Idlewild Park. In 1902, on July 12th, 4,000 people from Columbus visited Idlewild Park. So let's look at the park a little bit, some photos we've got in that. This was the entrance of the park. This is a map, and it's over here. I'm sorry it doesn't show up real well on this. This was a 1934 engineer map that was done. It's here at the library. And it shows the track. It'll show what the locations of a lot of the buildings were. Some of the buildings existed at the time of when they made the blueprint, basically. But at some point, somebody went in there and penciled in where buildings were. Unfortunately, I have no idea who penciled those in. They do seem to be pretty accurate with later things that I found, though, so I think that they did kind of have some knowledge of what they were doing when they did it. You can see the track that was in the middle. There's the Great Eagle Mound was there. Here's the opening. And so there were buildings coming in from both sides into the entranceway that I'll show you in a minute. And then there were some inside here. There were barns over here. This would be towards Riley Street, Cooper Alley and that. And then there were horse barns up higher than I can point. Up there where the parking lot probably off 21st Street is now. This shows you a little bit better some of the barn outlines. There's marked dry lakes, swamps, the swamp in 1920, the lake in 1898. We've got some photos of the lake, and I'll talk about that as we get to them because I've got something else that kind of shows that is where that was. There's a baseball field marked here, which would have been across 79. And as we talk about the baseball team that was there, I'll talk about that field a little bit and what I think on that. Like I say, a lot of what I'm finding, I'm just going through old records, just trying to find anything I can. So if you've got any information when we're done on that can help, I'd appreciate it. So again, this is the opening. The picture on the right was that photo by Chalmers Pancoast that I just liked of the young boy sitting outside the treasurer's office as he went inside the gate. So as you went inside, here on your right would have been the bicycle checked here. This would have been the roller coaster, what we call a roller coaster, or the switchback. This was the switchback there at the mound. One thing that happened at that switchback was an accident in September 1902 when Mr. Charles Baker, he was riding the ride with his infant daughter. It said as the car returned to the west end of the track, it reached the incline. It should have been grabbed there by Mr. Albaugh, who was the carney. He didn't grab it. Baker thought the car was running away. He jumps out of the car with his infant daughter. Fortunately and unfortunately, he collides with Arbaugh. Arbaugh goes down. The infant daughter lands on Arbaugh, but Mr. Baker ends up falling completely off of it to the ground where he broke both arms. So that was one accident on that very safe OSHA switchback that you can see there. As you went then farther towards what we call the entrance to the park, there was a check room there where you could check your coats or your hats, whatever you wanted to put in there. This next building is the theater casino. So there's a casino in the front, theater in the back. Most of these pictures are from the Historical Society. Most of them are, I think Chalmers Pancos took most of them, so I would say they're from late 1800s to early 1900s. They all aren't, some of them are stamped his, but what I found is with some of Chalmers' stuff, some of it, he stamps his name on it, but that just meant he owned it at one time. So I can't say for sure he took all of these. So that's the casino and the theater. As we keep going up, on our right, you had a bowling alley, the pool and billiard hall, we had a shooting gallery. So there was lots of little entertainment areas for you to spend your money and things to do here at the park. This map is from 1912 Sanborn fire map. Sanborn fire maps were made for insurance adjusters, basically, and what they were interested in putting down is what types of building, what they were made out of, and that sort of thing, where water was, so that if you were trying to buy insurance for your building, an adjuster could charge you correctly. So this is a section of that. You'll notice the mounds aren't drawn in here at all. So this isn't the scale, okay? Those, where that red circle, where I've got that, those buildings that it's got there were inside the mound enclosure. But the upper ones, that's the sheep pen, which the one that looks like a cross, that's the sheep pen, and those are the other barns. Those were over more towards Riley Street. So they just put them here just to show, hey, there's buildings out here. If you need to insure them, this is what it is. It does show, though, the two ponds that were there at the park, right behind the Hotel Idlewild, which Hotel Idlewild or Mound Builder Hotel or Mound Builders Inn, near as I can tell, sits about where the museum's sitting now, somewhere right there. So looking at this, if you go out there, then you can kind of tell where we think the ponds actually sat. You can tell they weren't huge ponds, and then I circled down there because it does show that there is one cabin there along the one pond. So this map I was glad to find just to show some of the different buildings that were out there, but it is not to scale to show anything about where they necessarily were placed. These are pictures that are of the lake. You can see it did have a couple of buildings. I found references to cottages there. I never found reference to, and those were usually in reference to somebody was staying there that maybe was a palm reader, maybe was a clairvoyant, something like that. They said they were selling snake oil, basically. They said they were staying at the cottage, one of the cottages at Idlewild Park. But they never put any numbers to them, so I don't have any idea whether there are two cottages, or was there one cottage, or that. I don't think there were a whole bunch of them. The bottom right-hand photo, I do know that is a Chalmers Pancos photo, and it is of Idlewild, because he wrote about it. He called this one a quiet corner in Idlewild, and he wrote Idlewild Park was considered an ideal spot for picnics, theaters, parties, family outings, and bicycle races. The scenic and historic resort was beautified by a dream lake for boating and bathing, and the illustration reveals one corner of the lake. One thing I did find in a Newark Advocate in 1899 was the city ran water lines out towards Idlewild to fill the lakes. So they weren't natural lakes out there. It sounds like they built them. So all that stuff as we're walking is on our right side. On our left side, as we were heading for the entrance, there's the Park Hotel. Two different versions of it. This one I think is from the 1890s. The other one's from about the 1930s of the Mound Builders Inn there. That photo of the 1930s from a site, Ohio Historical Connections got. It's a film on mound builders in Bluffington Island. It's worth watching just to see just because it has different things on it. Once we got past the hotel, as you're walking in, on the blueprint, it mentions that there was a refreshment stand, so I'm assuming this could be the refreshment stand or lunch stand. Then as you went by this, then you went to the dance hall. I don't have any photos of the dance hall. But there's a dance hall, and then by the time you got through that, here's what the entrance to the used to look like at that time as you were standing about in front of the museum looking in. You can see the embankments here and here. This is the grandstand from the track inside. This is the floral hall that's inside. So not quite the same view that we have today when we stand out there. You can see there's roads, and you can drive right inside of it. This is the floral hall, and office and restrooms were on the right-hand side, right as you went in the enclosure. So the moat is right to the right there, the ladies' toilet. Then as you turn around and look on the other side, there's the park office, and then if you notice the poultry barn. And now I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions here in a minute. I'm not sure what this is up, but this is the poultry barn as you went back there just a little ways. Now, look at this picture of the poultry barn from 1930. I'm assuming I'm standing inside the mounds and I'm looking out. It looks like the embankment is very low. Very, very low there. Let me go back. See how it's higher? And that looks like it's very low. Now I know that, and we'll talk about the Civilian Conservation Corps, that at one time they did add some dirt. So this picture's kind of got me mystified. In fact, we went out there the other night and I was trying to stand in all different angles to try to figure out if there was a ditch or something that they could have been standing in to take this picture. But it just looks to me like the embankment's not very high behind it. So you can think about that tonight in the middle of the night like I have been. This is what the inside track looked like. You saw there's grandstand, the great eagle mound. You can see parts of it here. So this was a half-mile track. That track started out, and they started out in the late 1800s. They had bicycle races there. They had foot races there. As time progressed, then they had the horse races there. Then they had motorcycle races there. They had auto races there. Just as time kept going, they just kept having more and more races there. The bicycle tournaments they talked a lot about having there on the saucer track. They'd line them up and let them go. Bicycle racing was a big deal in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There were 1,000 spectators there on September 5th to watch a bicycle race. And I don't think we can get 1,000 people to watch a bicycle race nowadays, but then they could. One first that was kind of cool out there was in 1894, the first annual tournament of the colored, and I'm using that's the term they use, colored cycling club was held there, which I found kind of interesting. Couldn't find anything else on it, but I found that. And in 1895, Lee Richardson of Milwaukee, Wisconsin broke a world's record riding his bike backwards on the track. Now, Lee Richardson traveled all around the United States riding his bicycle backwards on a track. So, and he just kept breaking his own record. So they kept having bicycle races, horse races there, motorcycle races, and car races at that track. It was very well used throughout time. The barns that sat over, like I say, they sat more over towards Riley Street. There was the sheep barn, the cattle barn, and then some of the other barns that aren't labeled, so I'm not sure if those were horse barns or what. But those sat over more towards Riley Street. All right, so the people that came there in July 12th of 1902, it said 4,000 people from Columbus came to visit on July 12th. They came in 54 railroad coaches in 4 sections, so they just kept coming. I'd love to see 4,000 people visit the mountains on one day. Now, I think that would be awesome. One reason they might have come was to see Private Harry Six. On July 18th, he was there. He was with the 6th Regiment of the Ohio National Guard. He was scheduled to make 2 dives from a 65-foot tower into a tank of water 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 30 inches deep. Now, I wondered about that. So then I So I kept looking for Harry Six just to see what I could find, and I found that he died in 1948. It said he toured the nation for years as a star of a high diving act. His favorite act, jumping from a 110-foot ladder in a tank of water, caused him to lose his eyesight in 1917. So I found his World War I draft record, and it did say that he was blind in one eye. So I still don't know how he managed to dive that far and not kill himself. Baseball at Idlewild. Now, baseball was a big deal in Newark anyway, but in 1902, there was a baseball game played there between the Zanesville Blues versus the Molders. In 1903, I found that work was being done on the diamond at Idlewild and work on a new grandstand. The Idlewild team of Newark is there, pictured there. In June 22nd, they had 6 games that week, and they played teams from all around the state. In 1904, they added a fence so that spectators don't overrun the field, and they added accommodations for the press. I'm not sure where that diamond was in the park, though, because in later the park there was a diamond built across the street, which is I think what the one references on that map for the Whirly Molders. And the Idlewild guys had been out of business for about a year by that time. So I'm not exactly sure where it was. All I've got is a statement from 1952 that somebody was writing about the games, and it said that the fans packed into the little fairgrounds grandstand, and they would yell, "Hit it in the sheep shed." And many a sturdy Idlewild player obliged with a drive into the shelter with a home run. So it couldn't have been inside the enclosure because the sheep pen was over more towards Riley Street. I suppose he could have hit it that far, but I don't think they would have been playing minor league ball in Newark, Ohio. So I have a feeling it was out somewhere behind the museum or someplace out around there, but like I say, I can't find any definitive answer on that on anything. In 1902, the 5-year lease to James Lingelfelder expired. The Licking County Agricultural Society leased the park then to the Newark Granville Electric Street Railroad Company for $700 a year. On January 5th of that year, Will Harris was appointed superintendent on Idlewild Park. On July 4th, they planned fireworks. On June 30th, Miss Mary Roscombe's pet monkey escaped up a tree. It was covered in the Advocate. It said the park police force is rapidly developing into a first-class monkey hunting brigade. And the police are ordered to climb around through the uppermost boughs of Idlewild's prehistoric trees with remarkable agility. All because advertising manager Charles Roscombe's pet monkey, Mary McLean, escaped. Mary got loose Tuesday afternoon, obeying an instinct common to her race. She hied herself off to the tall timber where she has since remained. Occasionally, a policeman ascends the tree in which she is located and holding out a banana tries to tempt her to come down from her lofty perch. Until Wednesday afternoon, Mary treated all such overtures with lofty disdain to the amusement of the children below. Wednesday, policeman George Ray climbed up the tree and, crawling out on a limb on which Mary was perched, held out a banana in a most enticing manner. Mary was getting hungry and shyly approaching the officer. She suddenly reached out, grabbed the banana, and scampered back to the extreme ends of the bough. Mr. Roscombe is certain that Mary will return when she is sufficiently hungry. Then it adds, at a late hour of Thursday afternoon, Mary was captured. Then in September, a clairvoyant, Professor A.J. Andrew, lists his appearance at Idlewild Park. And again, I've got to read you his whole ad, because this guy was amazing. Professor A.J. Andrew, world's renowned clairvoyant who has had 6 years' experience in 3 cities, was crowned with success, always welcomed on his return. This is certainly proof that he understands his business. Professor Andrew's clairvoyant and palmist reunites the separates, restores lost affections, hastens marriages, makes unhappy homes happy, wayward children made to obey, evil influence broken, locates absent friends, finds lost or hidden treasures, old estates, wills, deeds, papers which baffle lawyers, locates minerals, locates diseases, drinking, smoking, chewing, or morphine fiends cured without knowledge of the patient. Palm reading, ladies is 25 cents, gents 50 cents. 10 questions answered for 10 cents in silver by sending date of birth and lock of hair and a 2-cent stamp for answer. Address Idlewild Park, New York, Ohio. His ailments never fail to do what he claims for them. Professor A.J. Andrews, located at Idlewild Park, sells Addison's scientific electric belt for $1, the regular price being $5. It cures rheumatism, neuralgia, headache in all forearms, epileptic fits, dyspepsia, liver and kidney complaint, constipation, indigestion, loss of memory, general debility, female complaints, chronic diarrhea, spinal infections, nervousness, cold feet, spots before the eyes, sleeplessness, lame back, tired feeling, sour stomach, heartburn, poor circulation, and impure blood. This guy was a genius. 5,000 testimonials, 5,000 permanent cures, over 5,750,000 now in use. Endorsed by medical authority, recommended by suffering humanity, guaranteed by manufacturers. Over 100 sold in last 4 weeks to sufferers, which are giving good satisfaction. And all that happened at Idlewild Park. On September 9th, they had a successful season. Harris was recognized in the paper for being a good manager. In October, the last day of horse racing went on. As a side note, in 1906, James Lingofelder, who was the first proprietor of Idlewild Park, was arrested along with his wife and son, charged with embezzlement, not from the park, but from the bank that he was working at. And he was found guilty of all that, but he didn't do anything at the park, supposedly. So the park operates as Idlewild until May of 1910, when it's renamed Rigel Park and opens to the public. These are some things that Rigel Park offered, different events that you could partake of, matinees and that. I don't know what the serpentine dance was. It was taught by Professor Jans of East Liverpool, but everybody could participate, and it sounded like a lot of fun. One other thing I found on Idlewild Park when researching the Etherington lynching, I don't know if you remember in 1910, the dry agent had stopped down here at a saloon. They were hired by the Granville, sworn in as deputized to come in and shut down some of the saloons. He went down here, and he was basically they were chased out. He ran down Union Street, and he ran down past William Howard's bar, who's William Howard's there in the middle, Etherington's there on the left. He actually got into Idlewild Park before he was caught. There was a statement made by Bernard Romer of Zanesville, who worked at Rigel Park. He was worked, I think, just outside the hotel, and he gave a statement to the Zanesville paper. At the time, he said, "I was just leaving the hotel at the park when a streetcar stopped at the entrance. I saw several men alight from the rear of the car. The latter crowd was joined at once by several men who I afterwards learned came from the Last Chance Saloon, and Howard was among them. I paid but little attention to the men at the time and continued my way across the park when my attention was arrested by the sound of scuffling. I saw there was a fight, and another sound I heard shots. A figure lay prostrate in the road. As I hurried to the scene, it was Howard. After the shooting, the crowd closed in on the man I afterwards learned was Etherington, and pushed and jostled him to the side of the road, striking him and cursing him. At first he tried to run but was caught. At this point, he said that Vance Moore, who was an African-American employee of the park, ran out shouting, 'Let me take care of him,' struck Etherington several times with his left fist. He wrote, 'I saw that his knuckles were torn and bleeding from coming in contact with Etherington's teeth.' Other accounts he heard was when Howard was shot, Etherington was struck in the face and someone took his blackjack from him and beat him. But he was hustled off down the street towards town." So Etherington was caught just a little bit outside, the hotel there that stood at Idlewild Park, and then he was brought down and put into jail, and then later was hanged. February 13th, 1911, the park was renamed Mound Builders Park. That photo's from 1940. It's the aerial view where you can see the track. On May 7th, Mount Miller's Park opened under manager Mrs. Sarah Ferry. They had their motorcycle races, did everything pretty much the way everything has been going. But things started slowing down and the park started getting into some disrepair. In 1912, the hotel had been closed. That January, 100 people were in the basement having cockfighting. The police raided and arrested at least 100 people for doing that. In 1913, they started doing some improvements at the park. The advocates said it had turned into a rendezvous for rowdy boys and lovers who came there to spoon. And the Mound Builders Pavilion did open in 1913. There were auto races then for the next few years, of course, picnics, Labor Day things happened there. 1919, the Buckeye Band's Peace Jubilee featuring attractions was there. 1919, somebody had 3 hogs poisoned that died in the barns. In 1920, somebody tried to raise funds to put a cinder track around the mounds, which obviously failed because there was never a cinder track around the mounds. They had dancing there, square dancing and that. Finally, in 1927, the Licking County Agricultural Society deeded the Great Circle Mounds to the Licking County Commissioners. They deeded it to them with the agreement that the commissioners would pay off the fair debt of $25,000, which was done at that time. So at that point, the Licking County Commissioners take over the fairgrounds. In 1928, the Eagle Mound inside was excavated, and it was decided that it actually wasn't an effigy mound of an eagle. It was actually marks the remains of a Hopewell structure. It's one of those things, though, I don't know if we'll ever get people, including myself, to not say the Great Eagle Mound, but it has nothing to do with an eagle at all. In 1931, the 84th Licking County Fair formal opening was delayed due to weather. Also that October, the King Rodeo Company arrived at the fairgrounds and had 15 full-blooded Tama Indians, and they encamped in teepees inside the mound. This is their chief, John Buffalo. Chief Buffalo, it was written, and his Indians were greatly enthused and excited over the mounds. They did not expect to find anything of the kind in Newark. Chief Buffalo intends having photographs made of the mounds with his Indian groups on them to send back to his folks on the reservation. In 1932, the last Licking County Fair was held at the Great Circle. Then there was the great publicity stunt. During the Depression, President Roosevelt came up with the Thunderbird Blue Eagle campaign run by the NRA, which was the National Recovery Administration. The NRA was chiefly engaged in drawing up industrial codes for all industries to adopt. They came up with more than 500 codes of fair practice. They were trying to get all businesses and public firms to display the Blue Eagle. It said, hey, we're participating in this. So on August 31st, there was a Boy Scout ceremony kicking off the Thunderbird Blue Eagle on the Great Eagle Mound. As we've already decided, it wasn't an eagle anyway. So they kicked it off. No Indians were in this. They were all Boy Scouts or locals dressed up as American Indians to kick off this campaign. On October 33, the Licking County Commissioners deeded the Great Circle Mound to the Ohio Historical Society. So in January 34, the New York Chamber of Commerce pushed for a sustained campaign of publicity for the mounds. Seems like when you read through this, about every 10, 12 years, somebody was trying to push that the mounds were more than a park. They had significance, but it was just went nowhere, it seems like. Somebody'd say, hey, we need to do this, and people would say, yeah, we do, and nothing would happen. But in late 34, the Licking County Agricultural Society, they hear that there might be a Civilian Conservation Corps camp go in because of President Roosevelt's New Deal campaign. They're afraid that they won't be able to have their fair there, so they then go to court to try to say that the deal they made with the commissioners wasn't lawful and wanted the court to reverse it. So I'm just throwing this in here to show that in the history of the mounds, there is more than one court case happening. The lower court said, no, you signed this over to the commissioners, it's law. They took it to the Supreme Court, Ohio Supreme Court. Finally, but they did get a restraining order, so the CCAC camp couldn't come in yet. But once the Ohio Supreme Court decided against them, then it opened the way for the CCC camp to come in. So in August 34, it was overruled so that they didn't have a case. So the Civilian Conservation Corps camp in March of 35, Congressman William Ashbrook announced that Mound Builders was picked as a site for a CCC camp with a prospective opening date of April 1st. This was in March that it was announced, and that was pretty gung-ho to get those guys in there by April 1st, which didn't happen. By May 9th, the Advocate reported that there were 14 men at the site. One of them was the Marine who is quoted in that second story talking about what they're doing out there. They had 6 Army tents erected in the shadow of the dismantled grandstand, it says. They were working on the site of the old cattle barns in preparation of laying a sewer line from Riley Street for the camp. By June, they were still having trouble getting the work done, so they hired other workers from outside to help get some of these buildings. They had completed 1 of 6 buildings for the camp. They had 22 CCC workers on site at that point, and then they moved into one of the buildings. Finally, on Saturday, July 6, 1935, 220 men arrived at Mound Builders from the CCC camp number 1544 that had been working up at Schoenbrunn up in New Philadelphia. So they came here in July 1935. This is a photo that they took soon after. It ran in the paper. I wish I could find, I would check with the Historical Society to see if they had a clearer photo of it, and they don't. So if anybody ever sees a photo of a bunch of guys standing on the mounds and you don't know quite what they are, this is probably what they are. And please let me know if you find that. These were the men that were at the CCC camp. They were planning an open house and a public kick-off event. The CCC camp brought in a lot of money locally to feed these men. So as part of Roosevelt's thing, it was a good thing to have happen. They did have that kickoff ceremony on July 22nd with speeches and a band from the Elks. This is the only photo I could find on any of the CCC buildings. I've heard they were up where the current parking lot is off 21st Street, but I've also heard that they were over more towards Riley Street, which if they were running a sewer line from Riley Street, I kind of have to think maybe that is where they put them, but I'm not for sure on the exact location of them out there. I also couldn't find when those buildings were taken down after the CCC left. Some projects they did at the Great Circle, they restored Eagle Mound to its original height. I found that they said they did place some new earth on the embankments to prevent erosion. They did do some experimental excavations in the moat to look for rumored cobblestones that they thought the moat was paved with. Of course, none were discovered. But they did ascertain that there was 3 to 4 feet of the moat had been filled up over time. They built shelter houses out there. They built restrooms. They built the bridge over the moat that's still there. Those were the things they did at the Great Circle. They did other projects here in Lincoln County. The photo on the left is the cover of their camp newsletter from December 21st. It was the last Christmas in 36, the last Christmas that the men were there. The newspaper was published there on the right on April 5th of 37. They tried to keep the camp open. Ashbrook tried to keep it open longer than 1937, but he was unsuccessful. So that camp closed in July 7th of 37, and they were moved to Camp Fairlawn in Akron. Something else that happened in 1937 was William Laura and Augusta Worley deeded 6.1 acres at the Great Circle, which that would have been to the west of the embankment. This is a 1940 aerial view of the park. You can kind of still make out the track if you look real close in that. You can see some buildings located there, and you can see the roads going in. You can drive into the mountain structure. Something that happened there in 1947 was there was a dedication ceremony for a flowering tree memorial for the veterans of World War II. 275 flowering trees of dogwood, redbud, serviceberry, and sweet crab were planted all over the park. Quoting Laura Beggs, the president of New York Garden Club, she wanted to create a symbol to show outwardly our sincere appreciation and gratitude to the men and women of Licking County who wore the uniform of the United States Armed Forces. And if you go out there at the right time, you can still see some of the, I think, flowering trees that are probably left from that project. Through the years since then, it was added in 1966 on the National Register for Historic Places. In 1967 through 69, the Land and Legend Festival was held there at Mound Builders. In June of 67, they started a play called Where the Falcon Flies. It was a huge production. I think it had over 200 people, local people, acting in this. I've never been able to find the script, but it was supposedly traced from when the mounds were built up through just a different history of Newark. It was held inside the enclosure. I remember faintly going out there and seeing it, but I can't tell you anything, but I just remember where it was and that sort of thing. They had queens that they crowned for the Land of Legend. These photos were given to me by the family of Dan Fandry. They had Indian arm and leg wrestling. They had rides, all the good kind of stuff that you'd have with a festival. That ran there through 1969. Then it moved to other sites. In 67, the Ohio Historical Society approved the building of a museum at Flint Ridge, but they shelved plans for the museum at Mound Builders. In September of 1970, they did begin the museum at Mound Builders at a cost of $140,000, and in 1971, the museum did open. Then in June and July of 1992, it was decided to excavate part of the mound. It caused quite a bit of controversy. It did, I think, help those get some understandings, that says, between the Native Americans and archaeologists to work together. The Native Americans were upset that they were cutting into the mound. I don't think they had any previous warning of it, and so they came out in great numbers to basically say you shouldn't be doing this. Some things that did come out of that that I did find did answer some questions. There were different layers of soil that showed that there were at least 2 phases of construction. Another find that was that when they got down to the base level, they found that it actually, after they did a bunch of studying of the dirt and everything, they could determine that the land once was prairie. It didn't have any trees on it, so there was no reason for the Indians to clear any trees for the structure. So, but I know this has opened lots of dialogue between the Native Americans and anybody that has anything to do with the mounds, which that is a good thing that came of it. In 1999, a Friends group was organized with Brad Lepper, Jeff Gill, and Dick Shields. They began efforts to attain World Heritage status. In 2002, they began those efforts in earnest. In 2012, there was some work done out mounds, some excavation for a new visitor's path. It was at that time they placed the restrictions that said you can't walk on the mounds anymore. This is a 1989 aerial view of the Great Circle and the Octagon Mounds. In 2018, the nomination was made for World Heritage status. In 2022, information from the Ohio History Connection was turned over to UNESCO for review. And then September 19th, 2023, the mounts finally were awarded World Heritage status. A quote from Jennifer Altman says, "World Heritage is the world's highest designation for cultural and natural sites, for heritage sites, and that's the reason to do it." You know, we are now one of 25 landmarks here in the United States to make World Heritage. Chalmers Pancoast, who was a reporter, a local photographer in the area for years, wrote in his book, Hometown Memories, published in 1959, he said, "Coming generations will value this delightful grove for the historic ancient earthworks, which for a long time were considered as wonderful as the pyramids of Egypt. Interest as the race of people that preceded the Indians is constantly growing. Newark people and former Newark residents should feel proud to be identified with these ancient remains of a primitive race and should publicize the mounds of Newark whenever possible," end quote. So hopefully now all of Licking County will be proud of these ancient wonders of the world that we find in our own backyard. And hopefully that helps you understand some of what we did as a community that preserved them so that they could get to the World Heritage status that they have today. So, does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.